Thank you all for coming here today. We are in the hot seat here at the center. We're discussing the most important session, and the topic of discussion is really digitalization. There's been climate change, of course, but digitalization is really the most important of all. So I'm going to start with I'm not going to go into everyone has the session details. So Huli, I'm going to start with you. Let's talk about digital public infrastructure, what you're doing with it, how does it apply to you, particularly with a city like Buenos Aires, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you define it in Latin America.
Okay, thank you. Let me first say that I think that this digital governance model that Paul, Janice, and the colleagues from Guide has outlined, I think it's a very good example of what we are trying to do here with the global solutions, identifying a global problem and then going for a solution that has a compelling narrative about how making human-centered digital governance, and also trying to advocate for this proposal. So I would like to congratulate Paul on this. And there are some specificities of the Latin American region that I think are important in terms of how you could implement this type of digital public infrastructure. The first is that this report is based on mostly on privacy data privacy, and there is a huge problem in Latin America still of access to internet. And I think although they are connected, I think it's important to bear in mind that connectivity is still an issue in Latin America. We have the pandemic has an increase and has a positive effect on how digitalization increased in the region. We went from half of households having access to fixed internet connection to 2/3 after the pandemic. But in terms of what we call meaningful connectivity, not only access, but also having an appropriate device, having a fast connection, there are a lot of problems instead still. And then there is another specificity of the region that I think is important in how you implement these models, is that the lack of government capacities. So there was a huge controversy in Argentina during the pandemic about a leak of public information. The national ID database was leaked, and there was a huge debate about what were the weak infrastructure of the state. So I think that there is a huge problem of state capacities in how you build these infrastructures in the region. And I think that when you try to think of these models, of guide models, how to implement in Latin America, connectivity and state capacities are very important to take into account.
I'm going to move to you, Cheryl, because you can respond to her. Guide they have put out a very good report on this, Julia. Really, congratulations on that. How would you respond to it? Because I think India has taken care of some of these problems of state capacity, building state capacity, and also having access, meaningful connectivity. So,
yeah, no, I think Guide is an excellent initiative because it frames the problem in a very clear fashion and then provides a kind of a regulatory framework that almost any country can use as they go forward. And I think it's very complementary to the Indian approach. And the Indian approach is actually a very simple one. It says that if we can infuse public technology into the ecosystem, then 3 issues can be resolved. One is you can actually accelerate your quest towards SDGs, and therefore many of the welfare activities can be taken care of in much effective fashion. You know why? Because there's digital public infrastructure to enable that to move faster, right? So things like direct benefits transfer become possible, focused benefits programs become possible. And then you can have de novo welfare programs that can roll out very quickly to a large population. India had to do that for COVID vaccination. We had to vaccinate 1 billion people twice in a year, and that was entirely digital in nature. So there's very little exclusion that happened. Why? Because the building blocks of how to manage the flow of people, flow of money, and flow of information were already in place. So one benefit of public technology is that it actually addresses the SDG journey of any country. The second is that, in the digital world, we are dealing with this challenge of how to protect our citizens. And this has been a recurring problem. In some cases, we were even given up. The first digital problem that the state failed to protect its children has been pornography. And everywhere in the world, we've just given up because there isn't an easy solution to that. Merely using policy to do that hasn't worked. And so states have given up on it. You have now this whole issue of fake news, where again, states are at the verge of giving up. And believe me, these are minor problems compared to what will happen when AI becomes pervasive. So the only way to bring the state back in protecting its citizens, which it does, the state protects you from bad cars, from bad foods, from bad people, criminals, but it's not able to protect you from harms that arise from the digital world. The only way to do that is to actually combine public technology and public policy to regulate behavior of the market participants. And India has been now doing that for 7-8 years with great success. I think, this is something that needs to be replicated by other countries. The third role of state has been that it is an enabler of innovation. So here in the global north, nobody bats an eyelid if you say the state should fund some type of public research, basic research. Why? Because based on that, innovation would happen. But when it comes to digital, there is very little of that happening. And especially when it comes to AI models, this will again come center stage. And why would it be center stage? Why? Because otherwise, if we don't generate local innovation in every part of the world, we will rely on 2 or 3 American companies who will provide us the AI models, and we'll all be the consumers of it. So we would now effectively have compromised our digital sovereignty, and digital colonization, as Ambassador Sujan Chinoy talked about, would be back in vogue.
That's right.
So all that needs public technology to be infused into the system.
So that is the role. And we're going to come back to the role of private innovation in this. But Constantine, I'm going to move to you. He brought up artificial intelligence, which is the next stage where the digital public infrastructure will have to be accommodated, and AI is going to play a large role in that, whether we like it or not. How do we think about or reimagine standards for the AI world? The old methods of standard and certification really don't apply, do they?
So, this is a good question, but I would like to say a few words about the digital empowerment, the citizen. And there are here really 2 aspects. One is having the tools, being connected, and the other is how are you connected? Probably I was the only one in a conference in DC a few years ago where everybody was celebrating the improvements in connectivity, and we have several programs in India about how to connect the unconnected. And I was the only one who said, if we are to connect the unconnected the way we are connected, I would prefer not to connect them. I was the only one to spoil the party. And because of the reasons you are mentioning, and for one more reason that we are not talking about, but which is extremely important, of course, there is a lot of crime also through the internet and so on, and bad things in the content. But the biggest crime is another one. Is that we make generations of children, one after the other, addictive. And this is the white-collar crime. Who are doing this? The good coders and the computer scientists. It is addiction by design. And here we come to your algorithms. I'm not worried about AI in the future and so on. I mean, we're destroying childhood since generations through AI algorithms. And this must not happen. This is not necessary at all. There are very easy, clean solutions for this. And there is no excuse anymore that we continue doing this. So stop this, at least. This is easy to stop, and it is not the problem of the parents or the children to stop this. It is the problem of the platforms who make these services. They must provide age-appropriate services. Basta. They can do it. There is no excuse for not doing this. They pretend they cannot, but they can. And we must force them to do this.
I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to can you respond to how and whether they can be incentivized to provide age-appropriate?
He's absolutely right. See, there is AI can help you get to Berlin airport better because it'll give you, route guidance, right? So if it can augment you as a driver, it can augment you as a student, it can augment you as a teacher, it can augment the doctor, it can augment the patient, and all this will come to life in a very big way in the coming years. But AI is also used, as he points out, for distraction, for specially taking young teenagers and who don't have a fully formed prefrontal cortex and giving them binge watching, giving them games, giving them porn, and they grow up to be misfit young adults. And any society which is going to lose its young adults to distraction powered by AI will not be a viable society in the future. And so there is a tension, even today, if you see MOOCs, for example, less than 10% of the people are able to complete them. They have everything available to them. Why? Because the distractions are so high. So it's a societal issue, as he correctly points out, that we have to regulate the distractions, especially for people whose prefrontal cortex is not fully formed, and so that they can pursue a path of being the best version of themselves. And this is doable, and we must do it. I think you raise a very good point.
Paul, I'm going to come to you. We had a discussion about this yesterday. How can we, you're very concerned about citizens having access to their own information, going back to data, personal data, sort of linked up to all this. What are your thoughts on having citizens have access to their own data, and especially personal data? You said it can be empowering, and please tell us how.
Well, I think my first observation is I'm a technology administrator and policy person for a long time, but recently Dennis Snow has been trying to teach me economics. And I think the point we just talked here about children and access is an illustration of one of the key challenges we have. There is without a doubt a role for the state, and I've been a senior government official in countries and sort of, played that role. But we are facing a huge economic incentive problem at the moment in this space that we need to address. One of the reasons why these companies build these systems that are addictive and have these downsides is because they don't treat the children as the customer. They don't treat the user as the customer. The customer is the advertiser. And so what we have is a system where 4 or 5 billion people are part of the digital economy, where when it comes to e-commerce, the individuals are pretty much like a market and they know how to work. But when it comes to this influence, this hidden game by which companies, for the return for you to be online, suck vast amounts of information about individuals, put them into algorithms, manipulate them in ways to basically serve the interests not of the person whose phone they've got onto, but the advertiser or the influencer who's paying. And that market's, 700 billion more per year just in advertising. And so one of the problems we have is if you do the surveys, Fen Hampson's here, and he's done a lot of these surveys the last 5 or 7 years of all around the world, people's use of the internet and people's trust in the internet. And use keeps going up and trust keep going down. And consumers all around the world keep saying to government, fix the trust problems. The difficulty is no governments around the world can fix all the trust problems. We need government action, but we also need to shift the market dynamics. We need to shift the market incentives such that the players are not just driven by the needs of advertisers. And for that to happen, we think the key thing is to look at personal data for individuals. So at the moment, that stuff's sucked out like, no tomorrow. But where individuals have the right to control who has access to their personal data, and then very importantly, they have to have the right to negotiate the terms under which it is used, just shifting that incentive system forces all these companies to start treating their users actually as consumers. And we could end up with different incentive systems sitting within the flow, which will help address some of these issues. It won't address all of them, and it won't fix all the problems. But that's at the heart of our analysis: is how do you actually put that sort of process in place to try to shift the incentives within a global digital economy?
And Julia, your report and guide, you call this the invisible trade, right? The digital barrier in this. And I think it's very well brought out that it's under the visible eye. Can you tell us a little bit about, just picking up from what Paul said, I mean, this is about how do you manage this for good governance? I mean, really, how do you manage this?
Yes,
Your report had something very
I agree.
interesting to say.
Well, I think Paul can tell much better about the report than I do, but I definitely agree with you, Paul, that there is a government capacity problem, but it's a broader economic incentive model problem, and definitely we're not going to supply. We're not going to go for the government capacity problem if we don't fix the other part. But in the case of Latin America, for me, there is an important issue that there is no demand from the public about the privacy of data. There's no debate about that. NGOs advocating for this are small NGOs that don't get public attention. So it's very difficult if you don't have demand from public to shift for these models, because there's no incentives to have this conversation. So I think that the guide governance model is based on the public drawing attention to this issue. And I think that we need to find some ways to shift demand and to increase demand from the public. Otherwise, it's difficult to have someone taking attention to this and talking to what you were saying, Konstantinos, about the addiction by design. It's very difficult if there's nobody putting that on the table. And I think that's a problem in Latin America. And it's something that if it's not shifted from the public, it's very difficult that we will have that conversation. And especially after the pandemic, that we saw a lot of public apps that were designed with a lot of problems of transparency, and there was no debate about that. Nobody was talking about what was going to be the use of this data by government. There was no public debate. So I think there is a huge problem of lack of demand from the public.
And Satiru.
So, if I'm engaging with policymakers and they ask me why I'm meeting with them, I ask them, what is your biggest problem that you're having with your children? They are embarrassed at the beginning, so then they say, it is addiction. Say, okay, there is a solution for this. And there is no excuse to do nothing anymore. And the solution is here, really, here it involves all the tools we have. It is proper law, which in many countries exists already, then code, how to implement the law, and then standards. And here you come to and this is how we get engaged. And this is a full stack. And it is very easy to break the chain of addiction. But it's taking the burden from the shoulders of the parents to the shoulders of the ones who are responsible, the platforms. And it is very easy. If children or minors below 18 engage in the platforms, they must have an age-appropriate design. They must. They have been saying it is impossible. We are democratic platforms. We give the same access to everybody. This is cynical. This is not democratic. This is cynicism and serving exactly what you said. So the chain of addiction can be cut by saying, if there is a minor, if you detect a minor on your platform, and they know exactly the age of the people who are participating, they have about everyone from us, 20 million data points. They know exactly every time I go there who I am, what is my... So they pretend they don't know, but they know everything. So if you detect a minor, you treat this person as a minor. You do not collect the data anymore. You do not profile it. You do not nudge it. And they can do it. And they have proven they can do it, by the way. So there are frameworks, and this is very important for you as policymaker to know, and for you that now the G20 is coming to India, because this will be on the table of the G20. in the next meeting. Be sure it will come from other nations. It will be important also for India to be prepared for this, because you have how many minors? 300 million, 400 million? It is very
29
important.
is our average age. So,
Yes.
How many?
so let me, 29, our average age of the population is only 29 years. Let me tie these
Yes.
three threads together because I think they all come together. There's a political economy problem, right? Which is what you're saying. Citizens are not demanding it. Incentives are not aligned. And standards are possible, but they don't actually work in practice. And I want to share with you the India experience, but I will start with a very simple story. You know, this whole notion of HTTP started with W3C here in Europe. And all of you here have experienced an error called 404 error.
Yes.
Have you? Yes? Have you experienced the 402 error? No. Because 402 error was micropayment failed. The conception of W3C was that when I consume content from you, either it is free, you chose to give it to me free, or I pay for it. And since that payment system, the micropayment system was not implemented, 402 error was not implemented, therefore, what Ethan Rosenberg calls the original sin took place. The original sin was that I don't need the payment from you because you are the product itself, right? So that came about because somebody forgot to build the micropayment system. In 2016, India went on to build that micropayment system. It's called UPI. And today in India, we will do more digital payment transactions, small value transactions. I'm not giving you the value of transactions. I'm giving you the volume of transactions. We will do more transactions than China. I'm going to go west from there, South Korea, all of Middle East, all of France, all of UK, and all of US put together. Because the moment you put that infrastructure for micropayments in place, people are happy to use it. And therefore, the incentive structure can change. The second thing is introduced electronic consent in September of 2021. It is growing from popular demand, no push, it's completely voluntary, at 52% month on month. So if this month we will have 100 electronic transactions, next month we'll have 152. So this is a demand. The reason you don't have people opting for this is because this is a problem that appears unsolvable. It is unsolvable purely in the hands of the regulators if you don't apply techno-legal regulation. Techno-legal regulation means that you must have public technology and public policy acting together. Just the way on a potter's wheel you put two hands to shape clay, you must have public policy, public technology working together to shape the good behavior of the market participants. And that is what India Stack in India has done. And I think whether you copy India Stack or not, the principles behind it are applicable for the rest of the world to take on. That's what we mean by digital public infrastructure as we go forward.
I think that's I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that. Your comment about micropayments reminds me that Minitel was successful because it actually had a micropayment system through the billing. But when the internet took off, it was basically driven out of US dollars and by the credit cards. Now it works obviously for e-commerce. E-commerce is about what, $5 trillion a year. It's bigger than the German economy. But on the other types of these information transfer things, you're quite right. There is not yet a mechanism for how you to handle those payments, and we would be recommending the same sort of capacity. I think in some parts of the world, the point we're making to policymakers is for a mechanism to give consumers control about how they could use their data and try to change these incentives. There are multiple technologies presently available which could support that. And it varies. India's got a set of technologies, a set of other technologies we would point to. In policymakers don't need to choose a technology, right? So they haven't got to invent one. There's a lot of technologies there. But I do think, an additional point I'll make on this is, one of the things for markets to work is that the consumer is informed, that the buyer that there are skills in the market. And one of the difficulties we have at the moment, one of the reasons that people don't complain in Latin America, because they just don't know. There's nobody on their side pointing out these things. The people who are in the data markets, they know this stuff intensely, right? That's where all the markets are. But we have seen around the world in the last 50 years numerous examples of where governments have moved to open up new markets and change things. And what we've seen in each of those examples is the skills have moved from the small application to come serve the big market. And that's one of the things we're pushing for. If you were to change this incentive system and give people control, the skills as to how those data markets work will shift. And so people will be able to negotiate with advisors, with the rights of association, with not individually potentially, but with advice and the mechanisms like you're talking about, those payment systems, transfer systems. You could transform this market just as we've seen the same thing happen in pension markets and all manner of things around the world.
Thank you, Paul. When we talk about digital architecture for the public good, it's not just about consumer protection. It's also about innovation and entrepreneurship. And I think that we all have some ideas about how innovation and entrepreneurship is also, this is what digital infrastructure needs to do, is to encourage innovation. So, Shad, do you want to talk a little bit about what India has done with the India Stack?
The reason I'm optimistic is that the India model, which says, look, what's a good ecosystem? Good ecosystem has some tech rules enforced by public technology, some policy rules enforced by regulation, and has some market rules based on good behavior of the market players themselves, some level of self-regulation. Now, this India approach that we've taken to design it like that has co-opted who we would normally regard as the bad actors in making this happen. Who are the biggest players who have embraced this in India? It's Google, Facebook, it's Walmart. They're happily using this system in India to play by these rules in a way that is helpful for society. Now, the reason we are not able to replicate this in other parts of the world because we have a fragmented approach. The people who think about technology rules are different from the people who think about the policy rules and the people who think about the market rules. In India, by actually using non-profit, non-government think tanks as the architects of this ecosystem, the digital architecture, we have been able to co-opt all the three parties in the game. And so what my view is that this paradox that we have, particularly here in Europe, which is very commonly expressed, is that by just choosing the regulatory path, you're paying a price for innovation. And the way Europe is doing it, this is true. But this paradox can be resolved if you can set digital infrastructure that is used both for good regulation as well as for good innovation. In India, Google Pay is one of the people who benefits from the payment infrastructure that has been put in place to innovate on the payment side.
It's not calling the shots.
It is because by virtue of being able to use it as an innovation platform, it has to sign up to the overall rules of the playground. And that is something that is acceptable to them. So the point here is that we've got to go away from a very fragmented approach where we tend to put public policy and public technology in two separate buckets and happen to bring them after the fact. Instead, we have to actually bring them together at the stage of the playground design, which was, by the way, the original intention of windsurf in W3C. It's just that we never ever played it out correctly, and it is not too late to go back and do it right the second time.
And this table is exactly the place and the players to contribute to making this right. And so we can. Just to let you know, on terms of innovation also, writing not just Google Pay, but also very small companies were able to create a business. And India now has, thanks really to this public digital infrastructure, has 107 unicorns, I think, which is the second largest in the world.
I would just come to AI for a minute. See, because AI is going to change our society in a way that we don't fully appreciate today. Now, AI needs two types of regulation. It needs regulation of AI to deal with all the harms that we were talking about. But we also need regulation for AI, because if you don't create an model making ecosystem in every part of the world, we would then be relying on a few model makers in the world, and then you can choose to try and regulate them any way you like, but it's not going to work because they'll just be too powerful, right? And so you need regulation of AI and regulation for AI. And the only way to do this is to take a techno-legal approach. And that techno-legal approach again means that you have to put in place data infrastructure, public digital infrastructure for data that allows model makers to innovate better. But to do that, they have to agree to the regulatory principles that are embedded in that. And so that is an experiment that is going on just as we speak. And I think that's very relevant to every part of the world. So this is the approach, I think, that will serve us well as society as we move forward.
I think, Ben, I agree with what's been said. That I think this issue of innovation is an important one. I think in the model we've been thinking about empowering individuals in the control of their data and how it gets used, and having skills that can negotiate on their behalf. If you're a labor economist like Dennis, this has got echoes of the 1830s to the 1860s in the Industrial Revolution. And what we saw in that space was once that individuals had control over their own labor and had the choice about developing their own skills, we had an enormous boom in wealth and in innovation. So to some degree, here's a new convert to economics, just thinking about those market dynamics is going to unleash innovation that we just can't talk about now. We just don't know what that sort of change will take place. But if I was to give you some illustrative points we've thought about in the European context, if you can imagine that there's 450 million Europeans who have control over their personal data, who have people who've given them some advice about what to say yes to, what to say no to, how to set that up, works very quickly. They've got their advisors. Let's say they're cooperatives and they're societies, and there might be unions, and they might be all manner of groupings and private companies who are offering these sort of services. If I'm now an innovator and I want a new proposition I want to take to the market, I have the opportunity to go and say to my VC, give me 50 cents per person, and I want to go put a proposition to the people who represent 10 or 20 million Europeans and say, I've got a new product, would you like to try it? And I've got a way of doing that in a week. And I've got a way of finding out whether it works or not. At the moment, you can't do that. You can't, as a startup entity, you can't get scale. You can't get scale to customer. And the big players with huge data lakes have an obvious, and many people not so obvious, anti-competitive aspect about that, because it's hard to get around those huge data lakes. And, VCs are all saying, well, they've got all the data, why would I do that? If you've got new mechanisms, not just for sort of commercial things, think about all the public good use of data. The Commission and the Parliament have done a whole lot of work on, the idea of data commons. But how do you build an incentive such that people say, yes, I am willing to share my data on this healthcare or that issue? So it's as much about building a business structure and an incentive to allow this sort of sharing, I think, that we should also be thinking about. And that will vary, absolutely. It will vary a little bit around the world depending on circumstances.
You wanted?
Yes, I would like to come back to what is a public digital infrastructure that serves the citizens. And of course, we can use this digital infrastructure to design more intelligent cities. This is the only way for the future. And it is not about smart cities. Smart cities are really, I'm not a favor of the concept of smartness, because it's just technology and vendors. Intelligent city is urban design that enables us to have really a human life in the cities, which is not the case in most cities of the world right now. And more than 50% of humans live in cities, and this will increase. If we achieve a better urban design supported by digital technologies, then we'll do a big step towards a sustainable future. And this is not done right now. Second, so this is the enabling part of technology. Second, I think there is no innocence in the design of the internet. It is a disaster. It is by design. It is the people who designed it. And this is not an accident, what is happening now, that is really undermining democracy and causing massive, the biggest pandemic of mental health in human history ever for our children. This is not a coincidence. So we have to fight against it. We cannot let it be a Wild West anymore. Basta. And it is possible, exactly using the means that you said, with technology, policy, and a cooperation between all the, but we have to do it. And I have been, this is the reason I'm at this table, because I'm the few people from the technology that engage with the policymakers to do it. The others were saying, you are nuts. You have no idea what you're talking about. It is what it is. We cannot code for it. Take it as it is. This is arrogance, and we cannot accept it anymore. So we have really to do something against this. And I leave it here at a very general level, if you want to understand more, anybody of you, because we are doing it and it is feasible. But it is a civil war within the technical communities, and then it's not the bad capitalists.
Can I build on what he's saying?
Yeah.
There's a civil war that's taken place before earlier, and I'll take you all back to 1981. Here in Europe, an idea took root that telecom infrastructure should be public infrastructure. And in fact, some of you may remember in 1981, British Telecom was formed as a publicly owned entity. At that time, the world's largest telecom operator used to be AT&T, right? And the US view was that telecom infrastructure is private infrastructure. The point I'm making is that in every new area, whether it's transportation, telecom, and now digital infrastructure, there's been a period of confusion, whether it's private infrastructure or public infrastructure. Now, what happened in 1982, the US government didn't change its mind, but the US courts decided that telecom infrastructure is public infrastructure and broke up AT&T in the famous divestiture judgment that was there. And you can humor me. You can go now as we speak and say, birthday of internet, and what will come up is 1st January 1983. Because inside DARPA, there was this discussion taking place whether ARPANET will be public infrastructure or private infrastructure. Had the judgment not happened, it may well have been private infrastructure, but because the judgment happened, there was consensus, it should be public infrastructure. Now, I agree with you, we didn't implement it properly. Now, the point is, India has experimented at India scale for 1 billion people and said that some part of the digital infrastructure should be public infrastructure. It's taken a minimal approach, and it says only the part that relates to flow of people, flow of money, flow of information should be public infrastructure, and privately provision public infrastructure, because only then techno-legal regulation can happen, and only then can you create a digital society that is based on democracy principles, citizen agency, and yet can deal with the harms. This is an experiment for you to see. You don't have to anticipate what will happen. It is happening in front of your eyes. My request to you is, please, for heaven's sake, learn. This is important for India, 1/7 of the population, but it's important for the rest of the world as well. And this is the blindness that has to go away. And if you can please learn about that experience, IMF produced a report on tech stack just a month back. Bank of International Settlements wrote about the data governance ecosystem of India and recommended it for all its 60 central banks to follow on 6th May of last year. I could go on and on. The information is available. But somehow it hasn't penetrated the European consciousness. And I am hoping that it does. Because otherwise, Europe will be left behind in solving this problem as we go forward. I know these are strong words, but I mean every word of it.
There were some strong words on the table.
and I think it's a fascinating conversation. And I definitely agree that there are strong differences between the Indian model and what is being done in Latin America. But I would like to go back to my first point about government capacities. You can have an integral approach, as you were talking, and not a fragmented approach, because you can have public technologies because you have good government capacities in terms of IT. And we don't have that in Latin America. So I think there is a huge difference there, and it's something that we need to focus on. Otherwise, it's very difficult to go for a more integral approach. And also, you have a kind of dissemination of innovation and the capillarity of innovation. And in Latin America, we tend to have good unicorns, are very good stories, but very isolated from each other. So I think that there are two big differences between Latin America and India, that there's a lot to learn, I'm sure, but I think that we need to take into account that there is a global problem, but it's not clear that there is a global solution for this, because they are very different.
Can I ask by show of hands here, how many of you use yoga, do yoga? Come on. Quite a few of you, right? Do you think India charges for yoga? How many of you are from Britain? Because I'm going to say something which may offend you. So I need to know. I see. So, the best Indian art is in London Museum. So obviously they can't put a plaque in there and say this is the best collection of Indian art. You know why, right? Well, it's stolen. And so instead they have a plaque, and rightly so, saying this is the largest collection of copyleft art. See, India has produced cultural artifacts and given them to the world because Indian cultural artifacts are copyleft. Our public technology that we have built, you're right, not because of state capacity, but because Indians became techies, and some of them worked in R&D, like myself, and chose to build public technology for India. So it's not state capacity, but it's human capacity. But that human capacity is available, like yoga is available for free to anybody who wants it. So now the question is whether you want it or not. So take identity. I'll just finish in a minute. Take identity. 10 countries have taken it, and the 11th will take it probably by end of this month. Completely free to them. They own this in their own country, just like yoga. So there is something new happening. Just open your eyes to it and you will benefit.
Okay.
Thank you.
You've already asked the first question from the audience, so I'm going to open this up. We have about 3 or 4 minutes for Q&A. Anybody has a question
Or a reaction?
or a reaction?
Those who do Ashtanga yoga?
Do we have
Young
any
man
questions?
there.
Yes, please identify yourself and tell us who you'd like to address the question to, or generally.
Yes, I'm Alexander. I'm an alumni of the Stiftung Mercator, and my question would be, you said that platforms should identify when somebody is a minor and sort of adjust how the platform is displayed. And I was wondering why that only should apply to minors, because I think there are a lot of vulnerable people in the world who would also be sort of susceptible to addictive design.
Please.
And I was wondering why only minors. Yeah.
Thank you. So the intention is for everybody. It's not for minors, but we have to start somewhere. And nobody would like to admit publicly they want to harm their children. So this is a fight we're going to win politically. And once we win this, we have proven that it is possible to differentiate the access according to the desire or the needs of the people, and then we can take it there. So this is a tactic, but you are very right. It is about everyone.
Gentleman in the front row and the lady in the front row next. Oh, well, here it is. It needs to be recorded.
I'm Ulrich Grigoleit from Legal Branch. My question to Mr. Sharma. Do you think that the Indian techno-legal approach is state-of-the-art? Please excuse that I'm not well informed. In Europe, I have the impression we are running after technology because the adoption of technology by politicians is, well, not state-of-the-art. Is there a difference in India?
Sure, you have 30 seconds, then maybe you can take it offline.
I work for Bell Labs, Yahoo Research, Veritas, and so on and so forth, and did a startup which is part of Cisco. I'm not an exception in India. There's smarter people than me there who have decided that we will build this public tech as no greed, no glory volunteers. So India was able to tap into this human potential and apply it for building public tech. Public tech actually used to be built in Scandinavia. Linux started here. It used to be built in the US. For some reason, which we don't have time to go in, the community that used to build digital public tech in Europe has evaporated, largely because of regulators, by the way, but it does not exist anymore. And so there are only two communities that exist. Some that Paul has been associated with, IETF in the West, and organizations like iSpirit, which are IETF of the East. So we got to bring back this community. And this community has to have respect of the policymakers. The policymakers have to respect this community because the two of them have to work together to make this happen. And that mutual respect is a prerequisite before anything can happen. Till that happens, you can use the India approach.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Yes. There. The lady here in the front row. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Uwagboyo Sawe from Nigeria. To add to the discussion on the table, I actually think that there's a need for digital inclusion in terms of governance because there's a saying that in every chaos there's a cosmos, and in every disorderliness there's a secret order. In the country I come from, a lot of citizens have lost hope, have lost trust in the government. I think with the
Do you have
inclusion.
a question? Do you have a question for someone? Or you're just making a statement?
Just a statement.
Sure.
Okay, so as I was saying, I said data inclusion would definitely help in actually bridging that trust gap in the system, because a lot of persons have lost trust in governance, and one of the ways we can actually achieve this is by actually implementing digital or blockchainized platforms where citizens can have the opportunity or have the privilege to track or to have access to digital informations, government informations, and also to track budgets, so we can know how elects are being are they spending our hard currencies, and also just a minute, sorry, and also I believe that with digital inclusion it will help in creating stability in terms of economic, social, and politics.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And this is a problem we will set to the table. On that note of problem solving, we will end the session. Thank you very much, Julia, Constantine, Paul, and Sharad.
Thank you.
Fair.